In today's notes, we will look to provide some clarification on the 4 tissue types that we examined last class in our learning lab. Please follow along with your tissues concept map found in your note packet. Can you recall the 4 key tissue types that we viewed in the histology examination under the microscope? Nervous tissue, connective tissue, epithelial tissue, and muscular tissue all have place on this concept map. Let's recall what these tissues do. The primary role of nervous tissue is to conduct impulses to and from organs of the body. It helps maintain communication. Connective tissue does exactly as it says. It connects tissues, and sometimes it will actually separate tissues while supporting the body. Epithelial tissue is a thinner tissue that covers exposed surfaces. Epithelial tissue's job really is to provide some protection or allow some things to pass across the tissue through absorption or secretion. And finally, that allows for some movement across the membranes of cells and tissues within the body. Finally, we have muscular tissue. Muscular tissue does what we may be already most familiar with. It allows for movement by the contraction of that tissue. Can you take a look at your concept map with the central tissue fanning out in 4 directions and place those tissue types where they belong on the map? Pause the video, see if you can make them fit, and then continue. Take a look at the top of your concept map. Is that where you located the nervous system? Let's take a few minutes to dig a little deeper into this particular group. As you can see in the image, this nervous tissue was a sample taken from the spinal cord. And what's unique about nervous tissue is that it's only found in the nervous system. The other tissues we'll discuss today can be found across multiple different body systems. The role of nervous tissue is really unique. It's able to conduct impulses that allow for communication. The 2 characteristics of nervous tissue that give it this function is its ability to be irritable. Now, we mostly think irritable as a negative thing, but in this case, irritable means that it's allowed to be triggered. It's sensitive to stimulation. The second feature of this tissue is that it allows for conductivity. It is allowed to have these impulses that will travel across the tissue and the neuron to send a signal of communication. Nervous tissue is one of the more simplified groupings that we have. Really, there's only 2 different cell types that help contribute to nervous tissue. One you may be familiar with are neurons. Neurons are the cells of the nervous system that actually do transmit the signals. Neuroglia, or glial cells, are the support cells of the nervous tissue. They help nourish the neurons, repair the neurons, and so forth. As we move clockwise on your concept map, we move to our next major group of tissues, connective tissues, the tissues of the body that help bind and support the structures and hold them in place. Connective tissue's job could range from providing framework, storing energy, such as fat, producing blood cells, even fighting infection. One of the unique features of connective tissue is that it's made of something called a matrix, and that matrix is a mixture of cells and this surrounding jelly-like fluid. Sometimes it's very liquidy, sometimes it's much more firm and rigid, but that matrix is called a ground substance, and it contains fibers that can be elastic or fibrous in nature. One key feature about the connective tissue on your concept map, it notes that it's relatively avascular, which means that it may have limited blood supply. And with that limited blood supply, it's slower to repair and replace new cells and harder to heal. Your concept map allows for 3 different examples or variations of connective tissue, and I'm going to share with you 4. Feel free to add in or pick your favorite 3, but a cartilage is one example of a connective tissue. You may recognize cartilage from being in your nose or on the edges of your ears, but it's also found in our trachea and epiglottis, or the fibrous connections found in the discs between your spinal cord. And you can see some of these examples in the model that show the cells, which are the chondrocytes, surrounded by the matrix, and the very fibrous nature of some cartilages that make them more rugged and provide a little bit more shock absorption and cushion. Another group of connective tissues are called adipose tissue. You may be more familiar with us calling this fat. I mean, the adipose tissue is used for storing long-term supplies of energy. It's used for insulation, cushion, and so it's a valuable connective tissue when it's there in the right locations and in the right quantities. The next category of connective tissue is called osseous tissue. Osseous tissue makes up the bones in our body, and it has a much more rigid matrix, which allows for it to be much more solid, and that provides protection and strength for the body. Also, having those rigid bones and the connections of muscles allows them to be pulled and moved. Many don't think about the storage capabilities and necessity of bone to store important minerals like calcium. And finally, another important feature of this tissue is that it is used to create new blood cells within the body. You may have heard of bone marrow, and within that tissue is where we make new red blood cells, new white blood cells for the body. Another group of connective tissues is actually blood. This one, opposite to osseous tissue, has a very liquidy matrix, and so it's more fluid, but it allows for the transport of gases and nutrients around the body, and is also really important with our immune system and the white blood cells that are found within this tissue. Okay, we've wrapped up connective tissue, and we're going to move clockwise on the concept map. Look near 6 o'clock. Did you identify this grouping of tissues as epithelial tissue? Epithelial tissue is actually one of the only tissue types that we can find all over the body, from skin to the linings in ducts and glands, into our small intestine. We have epithelial tissue that's job is to protect, secrete oils, glands, or hormones, to absorb gases and minerals and nutrients, and to filter out wastes and nutrients and minerals within the body. As we take a look at epithelial tissue, all of these tissues have something called a basement membrane, and it sits on top of other tissue types. Perhaps it's the connective tissue that then adheres it to the muscle underneath. We'll get to examine all these tissue types when we get into dissection. But this one in particular, epithelial tissue, is avascular. No blood supply, meaning that it needs to constantly be reproduced with new cells. And when those old cells get worn off, when they're forming protection, we don't feel pain. We don't lose blood supply when these cells slough off. Think of these types of cells being found on the skin or lining the surfaces of our respiratory tract. Many of these epithelial tissues are also found in places that our body has glands, like in the scalp, along the hair, or in the salivary glands of our mouth. Epithelial tissue is named and categorized by its different alignments and structures. And so I'm going to take a minute to explain to you how we define each. The way they are built will affect their function. Okay, so if something is really thin, some epithelial tissues are only a single layers of cells. We'll refer to them as being simple epithelial tissues. Examples, number 1 and 2 are single lines, simple. To the right on tissues 5 and 6, you see it's multiple layers. We will call those stratified layers of epithelial tissue. We also name them based on the shape of the cells. If the cells are really flat, like you see in number 1, we refer to them as squamous. Number 2 is more cube-shaped, more square-shaped. We call them cuboidal. Number 4 shows us more column-shaped, rectangle shape. We'll call those columnar cells. So we put those two names together. In number 1, it's one line of cells, so it is simple. Because of its shape, squamous, we call number 1 simple squamous tissue. Number 5, multiple layers made up of square-shaped cells. We refer to that as stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Where do we find these tissues? Well, the most commonly found epithelial tissue in the body is stratified and squamous, like you see in number 3. An example of that would be skin. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue is designed to withstand friction. Also, this type of tissue, some of them have to be really stretchy. Think of organs that would need to be able to expand, like the bladder or a uterus. They have a specialized version of this stratified squamous epithelial tissue that's referred to as transitional epithelial. And finally, make note on your concept map, which ones do we find rarely? Okay, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar epithelial tissues, we don't see them in many places in the body, but when we do, they're usually in places that we have larger ducts or glands in the body. So we've got a lot of glands, oil glands in the scalp. Okay, we also have many glands in organs like the liver. Just by the name, you should recognize simple squamous, one layer, flat cells. If we want that tissue type to be very thin, there must be a function that supports that, like diffusion, transportation across that tissue. This is a tissue type that's very important in structures like the lungs, where you want to have diffusion of oxygen and gases across the membrane. Simple cuboidal, a single layer, square shape. Again, this one is going to be fairly thin, so secretion and absorption can occur in these type of epithelial tissues. They're found in places like the tubules of the kidney and different ducts of the body, even covering our ovaries in women. If a columnar cell is taller, do you think that offers more protection or less? More. So we find these places in the body that maybe have a little bit more rugged wear and tear, like the digestive tract or the respiratory tract. Also found in these columnar epithelial cells are many goblet cells that produce mucus or hormones or oils, and they're secreted up onto their surface. Especially if it's secreting something that's like a mucus, it can be an additional layer of protection for the tissue and organ as well. This is a crazy name. Pseudo stratified columnar epithelium. If somebody has a pseudo name, they have a false name. Pseudo means false or fake. In this case, this tissue looks like it's multiple layers, but it actually is only one single layer of columnar cells. Another unique feature is that they are coated on the top with these tiny little cells called cilia that are used to sweep away particles. These particular types of epithelial cells are found in our respiratory tract. With the goblet cells that can squirt and secrete mucus onto the surface, those cilia are used to help sweep and transport the mucus that has captured all kinds of debris and pathogens to help maintain a safe and clear airway. We're in the final stretch. We're moving on our concept map to our last group of tissue types, which is muscle tissue. Great that we're almost done because Maddie's almost done with soccer. But I just want you to recognize that we have 3 different types of muscle. Most of the time we think of skeletal muscle that's used to move our bones. But we also have movement within our digestive tract and within the pupil and regions of our eyes and our heart, moving that blood around. So recognize that we have muscle tissue that's smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. All right, we're back. Maddie's practice has ended, and we're going to talk about these 3 different muscle types that Maddie used during her soccer practice. The easy one to recognize is that Maddie used her skeletal muscles to be able to run and move her body across the field. We describe that type of muscle as being voluntary because her brain could tell her what to contract and what to move. Another type of muscle tissue that was using as Maddie was working very hard was her cardiac muscle tissue. That tissue she couldn't tell to work harder or relax voluntarily, but there were mechanisms within her nervous system that knew that that muscle had to contract harder and stronger to pump more blood through her body. And finally, you've got that smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue lines organs. Most commonly, we talk about it squeezing food through the digestive system. But hey, in an athlete's case, that smooth muscle would be moving in her respiratory tract, surrounding her bronchioles. And as it relaxes and expands, more oxygen can fit into her lungs. And as the chest tightens and those muscles tighten, we have less air that can pass through. Again, Maddie and most people can't voluntarily open and relax or contract these smooth muscles. We can't tell our stomachs to digest and move through. They happen involuntarily. So that's it. We have covered it all. Take a look here and compare my concept map to yours. How well did you do following along with the information? If you have any questions, follow up and let me know. That's all for now.